Hello and welcome to the Self-Storage Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Thaddeus Campbell, joined today by Austin Edelman of Colliers, centered in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He has been a specialist, not in self-storage. We're taking a little turn as the Safe Storage USA group is actually, I just got plans from our civil engineer for a 56,000 square foot small bay industrial flex site that we're doing a ground up development on. Austin and his team and his partners with Colliers have been amazing for us. And this seems to be, and we're going to talk to Austin a little bit about this, an asset class that more and more people are looking at as an alternative. So really thankful and excited to have Austin join us on the podcast. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. Look forward to digging into some of the stuff that we look at on the small bay flex side and just wherever the conversation takes us today.
Love that, man. Well, I always start this podcast the same way. Self-storage is such a small and unique niche in the overall commercial real estate market. I always ask how people got into it. And now small bay flex is very similar. It's a very niche part of the overall commercial real estate asset class. I'd like to know how people got to where they're at. How did Austin Edelman end up becoming not only a broker in the small bay industrial flex space? You've been responsible for a ton of leasing and sales, but a really someone who's considered a preeminent figure in the space. How did that journey happen?
Yeah, so initially I started out in net lease when I began my career in commercial real estate. I was primarily selling Dollar Generals and O'Reilly's, AutoZones, that type of product. It's a very competitive market space. You've got brokers from across the U.S. that focus on that, large teams that have callers, people, calling states and every market in any direction. So it was very hard to break into that space as an individual. So I joined Cody Payne and his team. He was always a premier proponent in the office industrial space throughout DFW. And as this product type continued to gain popularity, we started to see more and more investors that were coming into the space, cross-product guys, groups from retail, multifamily, some of the office owners as well. They were looking at diversifying their portfolios. So we started to hone in on these small bay business parks. You had a lot of local developers that, were building them, did nice product throughout county and ETJ areas that are not competing with the infill. It's kind of following the path of the residential growth. So as these business parks started popping up, we just started reaching out to these guys. We said, hey, we've done some work on these in the past. We've helped people convert to triple net leases, build income that they were missing out on. So we use that as a segue to kind of build the relationships with these owners and developers. And that just kind of started the entire process where we were able to kind of beat to the punch, where we met a lot of these guys before the space got too competitive on the brokerage side. And that just helped us, kind of lead the charge and really get to know these type of assets and how they operate and what to sell them at the best price.
I love hearing that. Basically, blue ocean strategy, right? Why fight a fight that's almost impossible to win if everyone's going after the same piece of meat?
Pretty much, yeah.
So a couple things that come out of that I wanted to follow. You're in DFW, and anyone that's listening that hasn't been in Dallas-Fort Worth, the growth and the sprawl that's going on. I mean, it's literally been 30, 40, 50 years of just not. I can remember being a kid and watching Dallas on TV. I'm old enough to remember when that was still airing, and the overheads looked really good. But I mean, DFW now is 3 times the size of what it was in the 80s. So that growth. Tell me how small bay industrial flex has kind of been tied into that growth in the overall metroplex.
Well, it's just been a key facility that small business owners need. So you have a lot of infill, tilt wall, concrete buildup, industrial. It's always maintained well occupancy. But with the surrounding suburbs, as they've grown, there's just been a need for a model that a small bay business park provides. You have your roofers, your contractors, your auto mechanics, even sometimes retail type tenants like nail salons, subways and restaurants, quick service type stuff. They're following all that growth as well. So a lot of these markets where there were home construction that was being developed, some of the retail didn't follow suit as quickly as the demand was needed. These guys that have built these small bay industrial facilities, it catered to such a large tenant profile that everybody that was moving to outside of Denton, the far north side of Dallas, up to Prosper, Aubrey, those areas, those clients needed space. So the Small Bay Flex was there to provide an incubator space for them to, have their main location, a satellite location. If there was a lot of home construction going on in the area, roofers could have a couple of their guys that were out there at a business park. They have their materials, they get called to sites, they can load up the truck and be there in 5 minutes. So that was primarily what these were beneficial for, is that, as the growth was so rampant through the COVID period, once everybody in Texas was allowed to kind of start moving around, you had out of state residents that just moved in to anywhere they could possibly find a home. And that was a big draw as well to why these made the most sense, because they're easy to build. It's not like a retail center. You have a lot of permitting and planning. You got to do a nice facade that the city agrees with. A lot of these parks, you can do them outside of those jurisdictions where you still have to follow several protocols. I mean, you have to do fire and safety stuff, but you don't necessarily have to concrete driveways. It's a metal shell. You go in, the tenant wants certain details, so you kind of build out the space as needed for them. So it's a pretty quick package deal where they come out, they take a tour, they like the location, and boom, you can have those guys leased up and ready to go in less than a week. So it was just a timeline that was consistent for them to find something that they needed right then and there. And it just kind of caused a wildfire.
You keep answering these questions in a way that gives me five more questions, and I'm trying to remember all the questions I want to ask. But the one I want to ask here, you brought up something interesting, right? We don't need to be on main and main, right? As a self storage developer, a lot of times we're going for, especially nowadays, different than 40 years ago. We want to have infill sites where we know we're going to get a lot of traffic. We know it's easy and convenient for people to get to it. With Flex, you don't necessarily need to be in that downtown perfect spot. You could be a little further afield. And you said something that, as a developer, I don't necessarily have to go through the city planning board, right? Nothing kills the viability of a project more than the city all of a sudden telling you need a high-end facade, you need landscaping for hundreds of thousands of dollars. We can be a little further afield and still have really good viability.
Oh yeah. And I mean, with the flex business parks, you don't necessarily have to be on a main street where you're smack dab in the middle of, a downtown area. But you do want to incorporate the frontage, because that's really crucial. You don't want to be tucked behind something, but you want your entrance to be right off the main road. So it could even be a county road or a farm to market. As long as you're visible, you have good signage. If it's a heavily traversed corridor, having nicer units up in the front with like a showroom glass concept, something that just kind of drives traffic to the property, where, consumers and people that are looking for, an auto mechanic, they feel comfortable driving into the space. It doesn't feel like a, single tenant industrial deal where they're going to be standoffish. It's just visually appealing is what's going to bring people to these locations. So, even if you were a couple blocks outside of town, if it was a main road that goes north to south or east to west, that a lot of people are driving by to go to their homes, to, their work, place of business, out to eat or whatnot. It's just the consistency of them driving by is what really drives the client base at these locations.
Love it. So I'm going to just tell the audience, Austin mentioned earlier Cody Payne, his partner. Cody and Austin and the team at Colliers combined to write a book, Flex Space Domination. I actually just finished that book this week. I read like 80% of it a couple months ago, and I finally knocked out the last 20%. Amazing material, and a lot of things that Austin's talking about here are in that book. Not only really good info, and kudos to you guys for really putting relevant information in the book. It is not fluff. It's like, hey, here's the blueprint of what you got to do. But it's also very readable, which is not always the case in things that are super specific. So kudos to you guys. There's a link that's going to go across the bottom of the podcast for any of you watching who want to get that book. And we've also had Cody on the podcast before, so you can go back and watch him as well. I want to thank you for sharing that information, but also wanted to tell people that you guys have put this all in writing where it's something they can go and digest. I'm going to dig into a couple things that I want to talk about right now. You've mentioned a few different types of businesses that work for a small bay flex. I'm interested to really kind of dig into your brain about when we're talking about small bay flex. A lot of people that watch the podcast aren't necessarily familiar with it. Break down exactly what we're looking at in terms of how big of a building or multiple buildings are we putting on a site? How big are the spaces that we're going to break out for somebody? And then ultimately, who is that catering to by building that size?
Yeah, so going back to the book real quick, it was just something we saw that was really important. A lot of guys that were getting into the small bay space, they were asking consistent questions. So, a lot of the multifamily guys, residential agents, they have a lot of books on investing, and some of them are, a heavy read. It's a lot of chapters, it's a lot of pages. What we wanted to do was just fill ours with direct information. So it's basically a roadmap from point A, what kind of build do you want to do? What kind of land do you need to buy? Where at? And it gives you just a total outline that's smooth, simple. And like you said, it's a pretty easy read. So we wanted to keep it short so people didn't get, worn out by it.
Just over 100 pages, man. I
Yeah.
was like, those are the kind of books I like to read, man.
Yeah.
It's digestible. So, and you said it. It is literally a roadmap, and it was like as simple as could be. Paint by numbers essentially, and so you've talked about this earlier in the podcast where this is not a complicated asset to build. That being said, there is a way you can do it to screw it up if you do it right. So really kind of want to understand what are we looking at for a type of a building and size of units that we want to do specifically to draw the type of clientele we're looking for.
Yeah, so I mean, it's all dependent by investor, depending on what type of capital they're bringing in. Are they raising money? Are they going to bring in outside investors? There's several different routes that you can take, but primarily what we like to see. So small bay business parks, they can be a single building, they can be multiple buildings spread out on a parcel, but each building is usually broken down. So depending on what county you're in and what the fire codes are, your buildings usually are going to range, we like to see them on the lowest end around 6,000 square feet.
Yeah.
So you can break that into multiple units, and you could have 3 bays, you could have 4 bays, you could have 5 bays, you could even go down to 6 if you wanted to, that were 1,000 square feet each.
Yeah.
Ideally, the size that we like to see and what we think is most ideal for the people that utilize these spaces are anywhere between 1,250 square feet up to 1,800 square feet. Once you start going over to the larger size, that's a more unique user. Maybe they've got a sports court that they're going to do where it's basketball, baseball, something where they need a lot of open area. But primarily for the concept that we like, you're usually going to do about 30% office, 70% warehouse. Now, that's a give or take number. You may have a client that wants to come in and build out all office and just utilize a small area to store their goods. But the small bay parks is a similar layout like that. You'll have, 5 to 10 buildings spread out on the parcel, all aligned in that similar fashion. So it's basically an incubator space. Maybe it's somebody that was doing drop shipping out of their garage, or, a contractor that was just working from his car. He's built up a good enough business base that he needs a space. So he has a little office where he can do all of his invoices, schedule his appointments, and then all of his materials can be stored on site in an enclosed warehouse. Has a grade level door, potentially two. But that is kind of the model that we like the most, is that 30% office, 70% warehouse. That gives a good layout for these guys that are coming to look at it. And, if they need to add on, they can make adjustments during their lease timeline. And just, 60,000 square feet for a total park would probably be an ideal size. We've seen people that go down to 4,800 square feet. It's all dependent on your acreage. So it's just kind of aligned to what size and style units you're looking at, and kind of what your growth plan is.
You just made me feel good because our site plan's for 56,250 square feet. So I feel like I'm within that range of 60,000 that you talked about. I'm going to get a little selfish here, and because we are in the middle of this build, and I'm going to, as I always do when I do the podcast, I try and educate myself, and hopefully that helps educate other people too. I want to know the common mistakes that people make that maybe make a flex park not be as successful as it otherwise could be. What are a couple things that you really advise people to make sure that they don't do to ensure the possibility of success in their park?
So land is one of the biggest one. A lot of people, they have that mentality that they need to be front row center in the best possible area, and they end up overpaying. And what occurs with that is, if your build cost gets too high and your land cost is too high, you're going to struggle to see a good return, because you could potentially get the better rental rates being there, but if your costs are too high, you don't have a lot of wiggle room to make any errors. So that's one of the biggest things that we've seen, is people they go look for land, they find something that they think makes sense, and then they get into it. Maybe the city won't allow it. They're making them do a lot higher end model than what's needed for that part of town, and your costs just go crazy. So that right now is one of the largest issues that we've seen. A lot of the times people are a little bit uncomfortable going outside of the city. They say, oh, well, that land's dirt cheap. Like, nobody's going to go over there. But with the nature of these, it could be, built, and then the suburbs, the neighborhoods, the retail starts to expand around that. So a lot of guys, they want the prime location, which we understand. There's always ways to work around that as well. But that is one of the main indicators that we've seen where, something comes up when they're going through the review board process, and it just ends up not working. So that's one of the main causes. Another one is you got to know your location. So there's several different models of flex parks that you can do. You can do an efficient build, you can do an economy build, and you can do a higher end build that involves more office, kind of retail looking parks. Maybe you put your grade level doors on the back side instead of the front, so it's cleaner. And what we've seen is that if you don't follow your market, you look into it, you see where the rental rates are, what type of growth is occurring, you build something that may not be the right product for that location. And that's what we really try to help people with. We do a lot of land reviews. We have a world engine model where we put together a quick scenario of, hey, here's your site. We'll look at what your max square footage is. Do you need to do any kind of retention, pond, sprinklers? We take all that into account. And that's been one of the main drivers as well, where people kind of struggle is they build something that's way too nice for the area or way too low end. So it's really important to see who's your competition in the area, what type of rental rates are they getting. If you need to do something nicer, maybe you'll get a couple extra dollars on the rental rate side. That's been the two big things that we try to help steer people to, because it's going to give you the most headache, and then you're going to either have to flip out of it at a lower price than what you built it for, or you're just not going to be successful in lease up. And the third thing, and we've kind of seen this only recently, a lot of guys are buying more land than they need.
Yeah.
And then they think if you kind of parcel off the frontage and utilize just the back acreage for the warehouses, you're getting your money back from the sale of the front parcel. But we think that's one of the biggest killers, because if you don't have the frontage for your business park, nobody's going to know that you're back there unless you have a great monument sign or something that kind of puts a spotlight on it. And then a lot of the cases, those retail type tenants or whoever ends up taking the front portion, they get upset or whatever because you have too much through traffic with vehicles and trailers, anybody that's trying to make their way back to their spaces. But that's one of the largest things that we've noticed. And it's just, I think it's something that people see easy as they can get their money out for the most part if they sell off the land. But we try to warn them like, hey, you want that frontage because you can get higher rates. You maximize your, people seeing your business park. And that's such a crucial factor.
It's interesting you say that. We're underwriting a deal in house that we're looking at buying in Texas that you guys are actually the reps on. And as we're looking through the rent roll, right, averages about $10 a square foot through the flex park. But the units that are right on the road that have facing the road are literally over $20 a square foot instead of 10. So like, yeah, maybe you think that selling that front parcel makes sense, but maybe build on it and utilize that extra rent you're gonna achieve from it.
Oh yeah, yeah. Because I mean, those units, that's where a lot of the people want to be. So you can build those into a nicer concept where maybe it's not as much warehouse. You have the showroom where customers can come in. Say it's a wheel and tire guy. You have all the rims. You have the nice all-terrain and the mud tires on display. They can feel them. They can touch them. They can see what they look like, and then you drive their car around the back and put them on real quick.
Yep.
And that guy is going to pay a higher rate if it's up front. He's got a nice signage. It's very highly visible. Maybe he can even set up a couple cars for display out in the front that people drive by. And it's so crucial for people that are kind of in between where they want more retail-esque space that they will pay the higher rate.
Love that. So you mentioned something earlier. I want to dig in. I try and keep this to a half hour to honor my guest time and also make it digestible for the viewers. We're shockingly 25 minutes in. So I'm so appreciative. Your information is so helpful that the time is just flying. I have a couple things I want to get to. You mentioned this idea of not overpaying for land, which I love that. I guess my question is based on, hey, if I go 3-4 miles further out, 2 miles, whatever, I'm not in that core area where land is super high. How does it affect my leasing rate? Like, am I gonna get the same leasing rate? How am I determining what it's gonna cost me to maybe go get land that is a little more affordable?
Yeah, so I mean, like take DFW for example. A lot of cities through the South, even on the Northeast coast. We've talked to several groups in New Jersey, Charlotte, North Carolina, those areas. Um, they're looking at sites that are a little bit outside of major MSAs. And it's surprising because there's just so much population growth that if you can track the demographics, and we use a city called Argyle out here in DFW, and it's a high income area. It caters to a lot of small business owners that like, units like small bay buildings provide. And 5 years ago, it was almost like you would say you were driving in from Argyle to go to dinner in DFW because it was a little bit outside the beaten path. And that is one of the highest rental markets in DFW now. Now, there's a couple factors for that reasoning. Uh, it's a smaller community. They've kind of, restricted who enters the space. There's still a lot of good opportunities to build metal business parks out there. Um, but it meets a lot of the thresholds that we like for spaces, and we just kind of use it for a model. But with the expansion that's going on, you could get into one of these smaller areas for a lower price, and you could still get higher rental rates because there's not a lot of product. A lot of people are looking for these type of units, so you can kind of go in and dictate what the rental rate should be. As where if you go into an area where there's a lot of business parks, maybe some of them are older, haven't been updated or well maintained. If you go try to build something new in there, you're going to be competing with those guys that are at a lower price per square foot. So if they're at $9 to $10 and you're trying to get 15 to 16 plus triple net, it's not going to maintain very well because those guys looking at spaces know they can go next door for a lower price. So it's a little bit more of an open market when you go outside, but you can also track a lot of master plan communities that are going up. And as long as you're within, a certain radius of those markets, like I'm not saying go out to the middle of West Texas, where there's a lot of oil fields and patches and do a park out there. But if you can, find a good area that has a lot of demand, a lot of high end growth, but still has good land opportunities, then that is a unique catering opportunity to still maintain a high rental rate as well.
Love it. I'm going to ask one more question. You've been mentioning triple net, and I obviously know what that means because I'm getting into the space, but not everyone that's listening necessarily understands. This is one of the big advantages of small bay industrial flex relative to self storage, where our overhead might be 35% of our gross. If you could, for me, break down modified gross versus triple net and how it sort of is an advantage to the owner of a park.
Yeah, so most of these parks in the previous years, the owners just had a base rate. So, you go look at a space, it's $1,000 a month or whatnot. You're paying that flat dollar rate for the space. And then the owners, they have to take on all the common area expenses, insurance, management, property taxes. That's all on them. With the structure of a triple net lease, the tenant takes on a pro rata share of those expenses. So, say they're in 1,000 square foot unit, a 1,250 square foot unit, they're paying a certain percentage of all those expenses that the owner was in charge of. And, it's just something that it's just been a whirlwind of the market where prices have gone up so drastically on a lot of these things, insurance, taxes, that type of stuff, that it takes a little bit of the burden off the owner if you have that in place and structure where the tenant takes on some of that expense and cost.
Austin, man, thank you so much. I can speak for us, owners of self storage and have developed self storage, that taxes and insurance are the two biggest things that we're dealing with right now as killers of net operating income, right? So that ability to pass that through, not being rude about it, but that's the cost of in a lot of markets of renting these spaces as the owner of the park. Not having that eat into your NOI can absolutely make the difference between a deal working and not working. I would be
Oh yeah.
remiss before we finish up if I didn't say happy birthday as we're taping this. We're a couple days post birthday for Austin Edelman. When this airs,
Thank
it'll
you.
be a couple weeks from now, but wanted to make sure I wished you a happy birthday and thanks so much again. You're seeing Austin Edelman's email down here. He's active on LinkedIn as well. You can reach out to him there. If you want to talk to him or you have any questions for him or want his help with something you're looking at, I can speak from personal experience. Their group is unbelievable to work with, and they are super responsive and always have very insightful and direct comments. Like, they tell you exactly why they think what they think. And that's from 20 years of experience, which is hard to beat. So, Austin, thanks so much for the time. Appreciate it, and hope sometime in the future we can have you back on.
Oh yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it. I had a great time.
I always like that. Flattery is never a bad thing on this show. We appreciate it. So that's it for this week's episode of the Self Storage Made Simple podcast. We look forward to seeing you next week. In the meantime, if you got something of value out of this, please hit the like button, leave us a comment, tell us what you thought, subscribe to the page so you get updates on all our future guests, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.